Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into one of the most shocking mysteries in modern European history. A case that shook an entire nation known for its peace and stability. When we think of Sweden, we often imagine a society of order, neutrality, and calm politics. But in 1986, the country was thrown into turmoil when its Prime Minister, Olof Palme, was suddenly and brutally taken from the world. His story is not just about politics. It is about ideals, controversy, and a mystery that still lingers decades later. To understand why his death became such a defining moment, we first need to know who Olof Palme was. He was not just another leader holding office. Palme was charismatic, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge powerful interests on the global stage. He was a man who truly embodied Sweden's role as a voice for neutrality, peace, and social justice. Rising through the ranks of the Social Democratic Party, he became Prime Minister and served 2 separate terms, guiding Sweden with policies that emphasized equality, education, and healthcare. But what made Palme stand out was his international presence. Unlike many leaders who carefully avoided controversy, he boldly criticized superpowers during the height of the Cold War. He condemned the Vietnam War, stood firmly against apartheid in South Africa, and openly expressed concern about nuclear weapons. These positions earned him admiration from many around the world, but also stirred resentment from those who felt threatened by his views. In politics, being outspoken often comes with risks, and for Palme, those risks were immense. Despite his strong international voice, Palme lived like an ordinary citizen. He often walked around Stockholm without security guards, enjoying life in a way that reflected Sweden's tradition of openness and trust. For many Swedes, this accessibility made him beloved, a leader who felt close to the people. But it also exposed him to dangers that few imagined could become reality in such a stable society. So, who was Olof Palme beyond the politics? He was a family man, a father, and someone who believed deeply in the idea that politics should serve humanity. He carried himself with a sense of responsibility not only toward Sweden, but also toward the broader world. His vision extended far beyond national borders, which is why his assassination did not just feel like an attack on Sweden, but an attack on the very values of peace and justice that he represented. As we begin our journey into this case, let us remember that Olof Palme was more than a headline or a mystery file. He was a leader whose life symbolized Sweden's identity in the modern era. And yet, his tragic end left behind a puzzle that investigators, journalists, and ordinary citizens have tried to solve for nearly 4 decades. In the coming sections, we will retrace the events of that fateful night, explore the countless theories that emerged, and try to understand why, to this day, the question remains, who really killed Olof Palme? On the evening of February 28, 1986, Stockholm was calm, like any other Friday night. People were heading home from work, meeting friends, or catching a late movie. Among them was Olof Palme, Sweden's Prime Minister, who had decided to enjoy a simple night out with his wife, Lisbeth. Despite his status as one of the most recognizable figures in the country, Palme chose to live without constant security. It was part of his philosophy. He wanted to be seen as approachable, as just another citizen enjoying the streets of the city he loved. That night, Palme and Lisbeth went to the Grand Cinema in central Stockholm. They watched a comedy film, blending in with the crowd, no different from the people sitting around them. This was typical of Palme. He did not want barriers between himself and ordinary Swedes. Yet this very openness, a reflection of his character, would set the stage for tragedy. After the movie ended, close to midnight, the couple walked out into the cold February air. They strolled casually down Sveavägen, one of Stockholm's busiest streets. There were no bodyguards at their side, no police escort trailing behind them, just the Prime Minister and his wife walking home like any other couple. It was this strikingly normal picture that makes what happened next so chilling. At approximately 11:21 p.m. as Palme and Lisbeth walked past the corner of a shop called De Carima, a man stepped out from behind and fired a shot at close range. The bullet struck Olof Palme in the back, mortally wounding him. A second shot grazed Lisbeth, injuring her but not fatally. Within moments, chaos erupted. Passers-by screamed. Some rushed to help, while others stood frozen in shock. Sweden's leader had been cut down in the middle of a public street. Palme collapsed instantly, lying lifeless on the sidewalk. Lisbeth, still in shock, tried desperately to call for help. Witnesses rushed to call the emergency services. But by the time doctors attempted to revive him, it was already too late. Olof Palme was declared dead shortly after midnight, and the news would send shockwaves across the globe. The assassination was not only tragic, it was almost unthinkable. Sweden had long been viewed as one of the safest nations in the world, where political leaders mingled freely with citizens. The idea that the Prime Minister could be murdered in plain sight, on a busy street, was something most Swedes never imagined possible. That night, as news spread quickly through radio broadcasts and morning papers, a nation went from calm to chaos. Shock, grief, and disbelief gripped the country. Within hours, the police launched one of the largest investigations in Swedish history. Sealing off streets, interviewing witnesses, and chasing early leads. But in those first hours, there were far more questions than answers. Who was the man who pulled the trigger? Was it the work of a lone gunman, or part of something larger, an organized conspiracy? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how could such a tragedy happen so openly, in the heart of a city where everyone believed leaders walked safely among the people? In the hours after the assassination, one detail stood out and shocked both citizens and international observers. Olof Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden, had been walking the streets without any security protection. Unlike many leaders around the world, he had chosen to live openly, believing that trust between citizens and their government should not be hidden behind armed guards. This was part of Sweden's tradition. A nation proud of its safety and accessibility. But in that moment, the absence of security raised haunting questions. Had this openness left him tragically vulnerable? Lisbeth Palme, wounded but alive, was the only direct witness beside her husband. She told police that the attack was sudden, quick, and terrifying. The gunman seemed calm and confident, firing and then disappearing into the night. In those first minutes, the scene on Sveavägen was chaotic. Some pedestrians tried to chase the fleeing man, while others rushed to comfort Lisbeth or check on the Prime Minister. Within minutes, ambulances and patrol cars arrived, their sirens piercing the quiet Stockholm night. For ordinary Swedes, the news was almost impossible to process. Sweden had not known political violence at this level. People woke up the next morning to headlines declaring that their leader had been murdered on a city street, just hours after sharing the same cinema as many of them. It felt unreal, as if something that only happened in faraway, unstable nations had suddenly arrived in their peaceful homeland. The immediate police response was massive. Roadblocks were set up across Stockholm, officers flooded the area, and witness statements were collected with urgency. Investigators combed through the crime scene outside the De Carima store, searching for clues. Yet in those crucial early hours, mistakes were made. The scene was not fully secured, evidence may have been lost, and conflicting descriptions of the gunman began to complicate the investigation. At the same time, journalists scrambled to report on what was happening, spreading updates across radio, television, and newspapers. Within hours, the entire world knew that Olof Palme had been assassinated. Messages of shock and condolences poured in from leaders around the globe, all expressing disbelief that Sweden's symbol of peace had fallen victim to such violence. But for Swedes, beyond the political and global reaction, there was something deeply personal about the tragedy. Palme was not just a distant figure. He had walked among the people, taken the subway like any other citizen, and appeared in public spaces without barriers. His death felt like the loss of a neighbor, someone familiar. The grief was mixed with a growing sense of unease. If even their prime minister was not safe on the streets of Stockholm, then who was? As the hours turned into days, theories began to circulate. Was this the act of a lone gunman, striking randomly in the night, or was there a deeper, more sinister plot behind it all? The questions multiplied, and the investigation was about to become one of the most complex in Swedish history. The moment of the shooting was as sudden as it was devastating. Just seconds before, Olof and Lisbeth Palme were walking like any ordinary couple, talking quietly after their late-night movie. Then, with no warning, a man approached from behind. At point-blank range, he fired a shot that struck Olof Palme directly in the back. The impact was catastrophic. Witnesses recalled that Palme collapsed instantly, falling onto the pavement without a chance to defend himself. The shot pierced deeply, damaging vital organs and causing massive internal bleeding. In that split second, the Prime Minister of Sweden went from a living symbol of leadership to a lifeless figure lying on the cold Stockholm street. The gunman fired a second shot, this time grazing Lisbeth's side. Though in shock and injured, she remained conscious, her voice rising above the chaos as she screamed for help. Bystanders rushed forward, some kneeling beside Palme in a desperate attempt to keep him alive. Others chasing shadows in the night, hoping to catch the fleeing attacker. The scene was a mix of confusion and urgency. Several passers-by tried basic first aid, but it was clear that the wound was fatal. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived, and Palme was rushed toward the hospital. Despite frantic efforts from doctors, nothing could be done. By 12:06 a.m., Olof Palme was officially pronounced dead. The entire ordeal from the gunshot to the grim confirmation had unfolded in less than an hour. News traveled with lightning speed. Stockholmers were woken in the middle of the night by phone calls and radio reports, many unable to believe what they were hearing. Sweden, a nation with one of the lowest crime rates in the world, had just witnessed the assassination of its leader in the open street. For a country that prided itself on safety and transparency, it was like a nightmare crashing into reality. The shock went beyond Sweden's borders. Within hours, headlines appeared in every major newspaper around the world. For many outside observers, Sweden had been a model of stability, neutrality, and peace. The fact that its prime minister could be killed so brazenly raised fears about whether darker forces were at play. Was this simply the act of a lone killer? Or was there a deeper conspiracy hiding in the shadows? For the Swedish people, grief was mixed with disbelief. They had lost a leader who had walked among them without barriers, someone who symbolized trust in the bond between government and citizens. And yet, that very trust had left him exposed to the danger that ended his life. Candlelight vigils quickly appeared across Stockholm, with mourners gathering silently. Still trying to process the unimaginable truth, Olof Palme, their prime minister, was gone. This was no longer just a crime. It was a turning point in Swedish history, one that would open the door to decades of investigation, speculation, and unanswered questions. The morning after Olof Palme's assassination, Sweden awoke to a reality it had never faced before. The radio, newspapers, and television all carried the same haunting headline. The Prime Minister was dead, murdered in the heart of Stockholm. A country known for its calm political life and sense of safety was suddenly thrust into an atmosphere of fear, grief, and disbelief. For many Swedes, it felt like the end of an era. Sweden had long prided itself on being different from other nations. Here, politicians walked among citizens without bodyguards. Leaders took the subway. And prime ministers could watch a film with their families like ordinary people. The nation's openness and trust had been part of its identity. But now, that trust was shattered. The streets of Stockholm no longer felt as safe as they once did. The shock was not just political, it was deeply personal. Many people felt as though they had lost someone close to them. Palme was not a distant leader hidden away in palaces. He had been visible, approachable, and present in everyday life. His death left citizens not only grieving a statesman, but also questioning the very fabric of Swedish society. If violence could strike down their prime minister in the middle of a busy street, could it happen to anyone? The government moved quickly to address the public. Acting leaders gave solemn speeches, urging calm and promising that justice would be pursued. Flags were lowered to half-mast, schools and offices held moments of silence, and thousands gathered in vigils across the country. Stockholm's streets, normally filled with chatter and daily routines, were unusually quiet, subdued by the weight of tragedy. The sense of national mourning soon turned into a wave of reflection. Commentators and citizens alike asked how such a crime could happen in Sweden, a nation often viewed as one of the safest in the world. The openness that had once been celebrated was now being questioned. Should politicians have more protection? Had Sweden been naive in assuming it was immune to the violence that plagued other nations? Internationally, the reaction was just as strong. Messages of condolence poured in from world leaders, each acknowledging Palme's role as a global voice for peace, justice, and equality. Yet even in those tributes, there was a shared disbelief. How could a man who had spoken so passionately for peace fall victim to such violence? In homes across Sweden, conversations at dinner tables carried a mix of sorrow and unease. Parents struggled to explain to their children how their prime minister had been killed, while older generations reflected on the fragility of safety they had once taken for granted. For the first time in modern history, Sweden felt vulnerable. The assassination was more than a single tragic event, it was a wound in the nation's identity. Sweden's image as a secure, open democracy had been shaken. And in its place emerged a collective sense of loss and uncertainty. From that day forward, life in Sweden would never be quite the same. In the hours following Olof Palme's assassination, Swedish authorities launched one of the most urgent police operations in the nation's history. Within minutes of the shooting, officers swarmed Svevigen, setting up roadblocks and interviewing witnesses. Helicopters hovered above Stockholm, and checkpoints were established across the city in an effort to trap the fleeing suspect. Yet, despite this enormous mobilization, the killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. The crime scene itself quickly became the focus of investigators. Officers searched the pavement near the Dikarima store, collecting what little physical evidence they could find. They discovered 2 shell casings, believed to have come from a .357 Magnum revolver. But the weapon itself was missing, and no fingerprints or clear forensic trail could be recovered. Forensic science in the mid-1980s was far less advanced than it is today, and without DNA technology or surveillance cameras, the investigation relied heavily on eyewitness testimony. Witnesses described the shooter in vague and sometimes conflicting terms. Some said he was tall, others claimed average height. Some thought he wore a dark jacket. Others recalled lighter clothing. The chaos of the moment and the speed of the attack made it nearly impossible to form a clear picture. This uncertainty immediately hampered the investigation, as police chased multiple, often contradictory leads. Complicating matters further, the first crucial hours of the investigation were marked by disorganization. The crime scene was not properly sealed off, allowing bystanders to walk through areas that might have held vital clues. Key witness statements were not taken immediately, and potential suspects slipped away before police could identify them. In hindsight, these mistakes would be seen as devastating, shaping the investigation for decades to come. Despite the confusion, the Swedish government made it clear that solving the crime was a national priority. A special task force was formed, involving hundreds of officers and detectives, making it the largest police operation ever undertaken in Sweden. Their mission was clear: find Olof Palme's killer and bring them to justice. But as days turned into weeks, the frustration grew. There was no single suspect, no obvious motive, and no group claiming responsibility. Theories began to spread like wildfire. Was this the work of a political extremist, a foreign intelligence agency, or organized crime? The lack of answers left space for speculation, and speculation soon became one of the defining features of the Palme case. For ordinary Swedes, this uncertainty only deepened the pain. Not only had their prime minister been assassinated, but now it seemed the authorities were unable to protect them from the unknown figure who had committed the act. The killer was still out there, free, and possibly planning again. The Palme assassination investigation quickly became a test not only of Sweden's police force, but of the nation's identity itself. Could a society built on trust and openness solve a crime that struck at its very core? Or would the truth forever remain hidden in the shadows of that February night? As the investigation stalled, speculation filled the vacuum. With few solid leads and no immediate arrests, conspiracy theories surrounding the death of Olof Palme multiplied at an astonishing pace. For many, it seemed impossible that a crime of such magnitude could have been committed by an ordinary lone gunman. Instead, people began to look for deeper, hidden forces that might have orchestrated the killing. One of the earliest theories centered on politics. Palme was not a neutral figure in the world of international affairs. He had openly criticized both the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, taking bold stances that angered leaders on both sides. To some, this suggested that foreign intelligence services could have had a hand in silencing him. Was it the CIA, upset by his condemnation of American actions in Vietnam and Central America, or was it the KGB, angered by his outspoken criticisms of Soviet repression? The Cold War atmosphere made both possibilities feel chillingly plausible. Others pointed toward organized crime. Sweden in the 1980s was not immune to the reach of international criminal networks, and Palme's government had been vocal in opposing arms smuggling and narcotics trafficking. Could the mafia, or another underground group, have viewed him as a threat? The cold precision of the assassination, a quick, clean attack followed by a disappearance into the night, had the hallmarks of professional killers, at least in the minds of some investigators. Then came the theory involving South Africa. Palme had been one of the loudest voices in Europe against apartheid, supporting sanctions and giving strong moral support to the anti-apartheid movement. Rumors spread that the apartheid regime in Pretoria might have seen him as too dangerous to their survival and had dispatched agents to eliminate him. This theory gained traction internationally, especially given how outspoken Palme had been on the global stage. Domestically, there were also whispers of involvement by right-wing extremists within Sweden itself. Palme's policies were progressive, championing social equality and government welfare programs. But they also made him deeply unpopular with certain conservative factions. Could a radical Swedish nationalist or extremist group have decided to take matters into their own hands? The longer the case went unsolved, the more theories appeared. Some were rooted in reasonable suspicions, others in wild speculation. Books, documentaries, and endless debates fueled a sense that the truth was always just out of reach. For every theory, there were passionate supporters who claimed they had found the real answer, only to see their arguments collapse when tested against evidence. For the Swedish public, this growing web of theories was both fascinating and unsettling. It revealed just how many enemies Palme might have had, and how many possible motives surrounded his death. Yet it also highlighted the failure of the investigation to provide clarity. With no confirmed killer, the truth became a canvas onto which anyone could project their fears, suspicions, or political beliefs. The mystery of Palme's assassination was no longer just a crime, it had become a mirror reflecting the tensions of the Cold War, the fears of Swedish society, and the dangerous power of unanswered questions. As Sweden reeled from the shock of losing its prime minister, investigators began following different trails, each pointing to possible suspects with very different motives. Among them, 3 theories stood out most strongly: Cold War espionage, right-wing extremists inside Sweden, and political enemies who had long resented Palme's outspoken stance on world affairs. First came the shadow of the Cold War. In 1986, global tensions between East and West were still high, and Olof Palme had built a reputation as a critic of both sides. He denounced U.S. bombing campaigns in Vietnam and openly challenged Washington's involvement in Latin America. At the same time, he condemned the Soviet Union's invasion of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan, angering Moscow. This rare position of criticizing both superpowers led some to suspect that intelligence agencies, perhaps the CIA, perhaps the KGB, might have viewed Palme as a threat to their agendas. His influence on global peace movements, and his ability to sway international opinion, made him an unusual figure who could not easily be ignored. But there was also a domestic angle. Within Sweden, Palme had powerful enemies too. His progressive policies, his support for social welfare, and his global activism made him a hero to some but a villain to others. Right-wing extremists inside the country resented his vision of Sweden as a socially democratic, internationally engaged nation. Some even viewed him as betraying traditional Swedish values by aligning too closely with left-leaning causes abroad. Police looked carefully at extremist groups operating within Sweden, worried that one of their members might have taken the drastic step of removing a prime minister they despised. The third area of suspicion was even murkier: hidden political enemies. Palme had not only angered international powers and extremists but also created tensions within the world of arms trading and intelligence. Sweden was officially neutral, but in practice, it balanced delicate relationships with both NATO and Warsaw Pact countries. Palme's involvement in disarmament campaigns and his vocal criticism of apartheid in South Africa may have threatened powerful interests. Some believed that individuals connected to arms deals or secret international networks might have wanted him silenced. As the investigation spread across these different theories, the problem was not a lack of suspects but too many. Each lead seemed plausible in its own way. Yet none could be proven with certainty. Intelligence files were combed, extremist circles were monitored, and witnesses were interrogated. Still, the evidence remained frustratingly thin. For the Swedish public, this created a growing sense of unease. Every theory that surfaced seemed to suggest a larger, darker story. Was Sweden the pawn in a Cold War plot? Had its democracy been attacked from within by radical forces, or was Palme the victim of something even more hidden, something that might never be uncovered? The unanswered questions kept the case alive in the public imagination, feeding debates in newspapers, parliament, and coffee shops alike. The deeper investigators dug, the more complex the mystery became, ensuring that Olof Palme's assassination would not fade quickly into history but remain one of Europe's greatest unsolved crimes. Among the many theories that emerged in the wake of Olof Palme's assassination, one of the most persistent pointed far beyond Sweden's borders all the way to South Africa. At the time, South Africa was still under the apartheid regime, a system of racial segregation and oppression that drew fierce international criticism. Few voices were louder or more consistent in condemning apartheid than that of Olof Palme. For years, Palme had positioned Sweden as one of the world's strongest moral opponents of apartheid. He openly supported the African National Congress ANC, the liberation movement fighting for equality and justice. He gave speeches condemning the South African government, pushed for sanctions, and provided humanitarian aid to those suffering under apartheid policies. To many Swedes, this was a source of pride. Their prime minister was not just speaking for his own country but standing up for oppressed people thousands of miles away. But to the apartheid regime in Pretoria, Palme was viewed very differently. To them, he was a dangerous enemy, a European leader using his influence to rally global opinion against their survival. Sweden's sanctions hit their economy, and Palme's words damaged their international reputation. Rumors began to circulate that elements within the South African government or shadowy groups connected to them may have plotted to silence him once and for all. This theory gained traction in the years following the assassination. Former operatives and intelligence officers later claimed that the apartheid regime had indeed considered Palme a threat and may have targeted him. Some accounts suggested that hit squads had been dispatched to eliminate outspoken critics abroad. If true, it would not have been unprecedented. The South African government had a history of targeting activists and dissidents even outside its borders. However, hard evidence was always elusive. While testimonies and fragments of information emerged over the years, investigators struggled to confirm a direct link between Pretoria and the shooting on Swedish. Documents were scarce, witnesses often unreliable, and the political sensitivities of the time made the truth even harder to pin down. Still, the South Africa theory remained one of the most compelling because it fit both motive and means. The apartheid regime had a clear reason to silence Palme, and intelligence networks capable of carrying out such an operation. Whether or not they acted, the suspicion itself revealed just how far Palme's influence had reached. He was not just a Swedish leader but a global voice, powerful enough to anger a government thousands of kilometers away. For many Swedes, this theory was unsettling in a different way. It suggested that their prime minister's assassination was not merely a Swedish tragedy, but part of a much larger global struggle, one in which their small, peaceful country had become an unexpected battlefield. The idea that a foreign power could reach into Stockholm and strike down their leader added a new layer of fear. If South Africa's agents were truly behind it, then the assassination was not only a national crime but also an international act of political violence. While some investigators looked outward, toward foreign powers, others turned their attention inward to Sweden itself. Olof Palme had been a deeply polarizing figure at home. His strong progressive policies, his support for international movements, and his outspoken criticism of both East and West made him a hero to many, but also an enemy to some within his own country. Among his fiercest domestic opponents were right-wing extremists. During the 1980s, Sweden was not immune to the rise of nationalist and far-right groups, who despised Palme for what they saw as his betrayal of Swedish traditions. To them, he was too liberal, too internationalist, and too willing to challenge powerful allies abroad. His open support for anti-apartheid movements and his criticism of U.S. policies in Vietnam and Central America painted him, in the eyes of some extremists, as dangerously un-Swedish. The theory that a far-right radical might have acted alone, driven by ideology and hatred, seemed plausible. Investigators explored this possibility, interviewing individuals linked to extremist organizations and monitoring their activities. Several suspects were considered, but time and again, the evidence failed to link any of them directly to the shooting. Still, the idea that Palme's killer could have been a homegrown extremist never disappeared. Even more unsettling were the whispers about secret services, either Swedish or foreign. Some speculated that elements within intelligence circles, possibly frustrated by Palme's independent foreign policy, might have decided to remove him. The Prime Minister had a reputation for being unpredictable, refusing to align firmly with either NATO or the Soviet bloc. In a world defined by Cold War loyalties, this independence could be seen as dangerous. Conspiracy theories flourished around the notion that shadowy forces within Sweden's own security establishment had allowed, or even orchestrated, the assassination. Critics pointed to the chaotic police investigation as suspicious. Was it simply incompetence, or was it deliberate obstruction to protect hidden actors? The lack of progress in the case only fueled these suspicions. Some believed the Swedish military's secret intelligence units, tied to NATO through back channels, might have viewed Palme as a liability because of his peace advocacy and his desire for nuclear disarmament. Others argued that the Soviets may have had informants in Sweden's intelligence system, creating a tangled web of suspicion that was nearly impossible to unravel. For ordinary Swedes, these theories were deeply unsettling. It was one thing to imagine a lone extremist pulling the trigger, but quite another to consider that the very institutions meant to protect their democracy might have been compromised. If true, it would mean that Palme's assassination was not just a random act of violence but the result of a hidden power struggle inside the machinery of the state. Though no definitive evidence ever surfaced to prove these suspicions, the mere possibility was enough to haunt Sweden for decades. In the absence of clear answers, the theory that Palme fell victim to forces within his own country remained one of the darkest and most enduring possibilities in the case. As years passed, Sweden poured enormous resources into finding Olof Palme's killer. The investigation became the largest in the country's history, spanning decades, consuming millions of kronor, and involving thousands of interviews. At its peak, hundreds of officers worked on the case, combing through evidence, following leads, and re-examining witness accounts. Yet, despite this massive effort, the truth remained out of reach. From the very beginning, investigators faced challenges. Witness descriptions of the shooter were inconsistent, forensic evidence was minimal, and crucial mistakes in the early hours had weakened the case. Over time, these problems only grew worse. Leads went cold, suspects came and went, and public frustration mounted. One of the most infamous moments in the investigation came with the arrest of Christer Pettersson, a small-time criminal with a history of violence and substance abuse. In 1988, just 2 years after the murder, Pettersson was identified in a police lineup by Lisbeth Palme, who claimed he was the man she saw that night. For a moment, it seemed the case might finally be solved. Pettersson was convicted in a lower court, but the verdict did not last. On appeal, he was acquitted due to lack of evidence. There was no murder weapon, no forensic proof, and doubts about the reliability of witness testimony. The acquittal was a crushing blow, leaving the investigation back at square one. For many Swedes, it was a moment of deep disappointment, reinforcing the sense that justice might never be served. Over the years, other suspects surfaced: arms dealers, political radicals, foreign agents, but none could be tied conclusively to the crime. Each time a new lead was announced, hope would rise, only to collapse again when evidence failed to hold up under scrutiny. The case became notorious not only for its tragedy but also for the sheer inability of the authorities to provide closure. The lack of resolution had a profound effect on Swedish society. Palme's assassination was not just a political murder. It became a national wound, reopened again and again with every failed lead. Citizens began to lose confidence in the police, questioning whether incompetence or something darker had prevented the truth from emerging. The investigation, once a symbol of determination, gradually became a symbol of frustration. Internationally, the unsolved nature of the case added to its mystique. Sweden, a country admired for its stability and efficiency, seemed powerless in the face of one of the most shocking crimes on European soil. The fact that no one had been held accountable became part of the tragedy itself, as if Palme's death was destined to remain an unanswered question. By the 1990s and 2000s, the case had grown into more than an investigation. It had become a mystery that defined a generation, one that every Swede knew but none could explain. Despite endless hours of work, despite global attention, the identity of Olof Palme's killer remained locked in silence, leaving a legacy of uncertainty that still lingers today. Decades have passed since that cold February night in 1986, yet the murder of Olof Palme still casts a long shadow over Sweden and the world. Despite countless theories, suspects, and investigations, the identity of his killer has never been definitively proven. What began as a shocking tragedy on the streets of Stockholm has endured as one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of modern times. Palme's assassination was not only a national loss but also a symbolic one. He was more than Sweden's prime minister, he was a global voice for justice, peace, and equality. His willingness to challenge powerful nations and defend oppressed peoples made him a unique figure in Cold War politics. And it was precisely this boldness that may have cost him his life. Yet without answers, the true motive remains hidden, lost in a labyrinth of speculation. In Sweden, the assassination marked a turning point. It shattered the nation's sense of security and forced a reckoning with the idea that even in one of the world's most peaceful democracies, violence could strike at the very top. The open society that Palme cherished would never be the same again. Political leaders began moving with tighter security, and ordinary citizens carried with them a sense of unease that lingered long after the night of the murder. Globally, the case became a subject of fascination. Writers, journalists, and filmmakers have explored every angle: lone gunmen, foreign intelligence plots, right-wing extremists, organized crime, even rogue elements within Sweden itself. Each theory offered a glimpse of possibility but no final resolution. The absence of closure only deepened the mystery, ensuring that Palme's death would remain the subject of endless debate. In 2020, Swedish prosecutors finally named a suspect, Stig Engström, known as the Skandier Man, an office worker who had been near the crime scene. But because Engström had died years earlier, the case was officially closed without a trial. For many, this conclusion felt hollow, raising more doubts than answers. Was Engström really the killer, or simply a convenient ending to a case that authorities could no longer solve? The debate continues to this day. What remains certain is the impact. Olof Palme's death was not just the end of a man but the end of an era, a reminder that ideals, no matter how noble, can make one vulnerable in a world of hidden rivalries and dangerous interests. His assassination is remembered not only for the crime itself but for the questions it left behind, questions that haunt Sweden and intrigue the world even now. And so, the story of Olof Palme stands beside other great unsolved mysteries of history, a crime without closure, a riddle without a final answer. Decades later, his name is still spoken with both admiration and sorrow, his legacy honored but his death unresolved. The night of February 28th. 1986 will forever remain one of the darkest chapters in Sweden's modern history, a moment when peace was shattered, and a mystery was born. And that brings us to the end of today's journey into the mysterious assassination of Olof Palme. More than 3 decades later, the case remains unsolved, leaving behind unanswered questions that continue to fascinate, frustrate, and unsettle. Was he the victim of a lone gunman, a political conspiracy, or something even more complex? Perhaps we may never know. But what is certain is that his legacy as a voice for peace and justice still echoes today. Thank you so much for watching and for taking the time to explore this story with me. These mysteries of history remind us not only of the fragility of human life but also of the power of ideals that live on long after leaders are gone. If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. Share it with friends who love history and unsolved cases. And of course, make sure to subscribe if you have not already. That way, you won't miss the next episode as we dive into more fascinating stories from around the world. I would also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened to Olof Palme? Was it a lone attacker, a Cold War plot, or perhaps something else entirely? Drop your theories in the comments. I will be reading them all. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the mysteries that history leaves behind. See you in the next story.